Hey everyone, my name is Matt. Welcome to my shop. Today I'm going to show you how I made these decorative finials and urns for the upper case of my secretary desk. So let's get started. Using my pattern as a guide, I lay out the transition points of the urn. This blank is going to give me 2 urns. I start by defining the tops of the urns. The top area has a bead in between 2 flats, and this bead is the widest part of the turning. Next I start working on the S-curve that transitions from the top of the urn into the stem. I use the parting tool to establish some depth references using my caliper to check for the correct diameter. Once the waste is removed, I can start to refine the curve. At the bottom of the S-curve is another bead. The bead starts at the end of the S-curve and they need to be tightly together. I use a skew to create this detail. Next I can work on the small cove. And the last detail I create is the roundover on the base. And now I can sand both urns. I spent a lot of time sanding to remove any roughness or tear out. Before I take them off the lathe, I create a recess on the underside of the base, so the outside of the base will contact the transition piece on the upper case. Now I can cut them apart and cut away the waste. The last thing I need to do is drill a hole in the top to receive the finial. This would be better done on the lathe, but since I didn't have a good way to grab that tenon, I just did it on the drill press. I drilled a hole in a scrap piece of wood that I could mount the urn into, and then I drilled a hole for the finial. So now the urns are done, let's start working on the flame finials. I start by laying out the transition points from the pattern onto the blank. The last point I mark is where the blank starts to taper towards the top. Now I can start turning the detailed portions. I start by turning the tenon on the bottom, which will go into the urn. I check its thickness with the caliper as I go, and then I add the flat portion of the profile and start turning the cove. The last bit of turning is to introduce a taper to the top of the finial. Next I can start laying out the spirals. I am spacing them a ½ inch apart, so I draw lines every ½ inch. I'm doing a 3-flute spiral, so I divide up the cylinder into thirds. And I just did this by eye. Now I can start to draw the spirals. I just connect the corners to corners and just give myself a rough indicator of where they're going to be. And these lines will be the valley of each spiral. I add a piece of tape to my handsaw to act as a depth stop, and begin sawing along those lines to establish the depth. I then draw a rough center line between the cuts. This will be the peak of the spiral. Now I can start carving the spiral. I'm using a carving gouge to remove the majority of the waste. I'll lock the spindle on the lathe, carve to the right side of the line, and go all the way across. Then I'll rotate the lathe, lock it again, and keep carving. Once I've made it all the way around, I turn the finial end for end so I can carve on the other side of the line and still be going with the grain. Now I can start to refine the shape with a round file. I keep filing until the shape seems right and the cut lines disappear. Towards the tip, I switch to a narrower file. The last step on the lathe is to sand the entire finial. It was tedious work to get all the file marks out and to even out the entire surface. Next I can cut the finial away from the waste. And now to work on the top. The idea here is to make all the spirals converge into one point. I kept filing the flutes until they all met at one point. Here's a close-up of how the top looks after filing and sanding. So now the finial can go right into the urn and mount like that. The urn gets mounted onto this little transition block. It's just a square piece with some rounded over edges, and that goes through the tenon on the bottom of the urn. And that whole assembly gets put onto the case into a hole that's drilled in the top there. Now before making these, I could count the number of spindle turnings I've done on one hand. So an experienced turner would be able to probably make these a little faster than I did. Just to give you an idea, the urns took me about 45 minutes to an hour each, and then the first flame finial I made took me 3 hours, and the other two took me 2 hours each. Now the patterns and the templates that I used to make these urns and finials came from this book, Building Period Furniture by Glen and Huey. And I'll leave a link to this book in the description too if you want to take a look at that. So I hope you enjoyed the video. I know I learned quite a bit doing this whole process, so hopefully maybe you'll try it someday too. Who knows? So thank you as always for watching. I greatly appreciate it. If you have any questions or comments about anything I showed today or anything else here in my shop, please feel free to leave me a comment. As always, I appreciate those, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. And until next time, happy woodworking.